In late February 2024, a small community in the Western Cape was stunned into an anxious urgency when a 6-year-old girl did not come home. Her name was Joshlin Smith. The place was Saldanha Bay, and the immediate area of the search included Middlepass and adjacent settlements where families live close to one another. Neighbors know one another's children, and missing persons cases can quickly become communal crises. The initial hours after Joshlin's disappearance were ordinary only in the way any families panic as frantic calls, phone checks, doors opened and closed, adults and older children combing the local streets. Word moved through the community by voice and WhatsApp. A child was missing. Local news picked it up. The police were informed. Neighbors and volunteers began searching nearby areas, drains, and places where a child might wander or be hidden. This is the universal first movement in disappearances: hope and mobilization. As days passed with no sign of Joshlin, the concern widened beyond neighbors. Local activists and church groups publicized her photo. Fundraisers and a reward were mentioned in community threads. Volunteers expanded the search radius. The missing child posters that once circulated locally began to appear online, and national outlets picked up the story. For a moment, Saldanha Bay's ordinary rhythm shifted to the single urgent task of finding a child. Early statements from police and the family were careful. In nearly every such case, authorities ask for time to verify leads, but public patience frays quickly when a child is involved. In this case, the situation became more complicated because the mother, Raquel Kelly Smith, was publicly questioned about her account of where Joshlin had been, left, and who had custody at the time of the disappearance. Media reports indicated inconsistencies in early statements, not unusual in the fog, immediately following a traumatic event, but nevertheless significant once investigators began to assemble a timeline. When a missing child case shows early ambiguity about the last known movements and about the primary caregiver's statements, investigators typically widen their net, check family contacts, phone records, social media messages, witnesses at the last known location, and any CCTV that might be available. In Joshlin's case, this meant interviewing neighbors, speaking with relatives, and tracing the mother's reported movements and contacts. It meant searching for any sign the child had been placed in the care of another adult or had been taken. A central fact that later became pivotal to the prosecution emerged during the early phase of the investigation. Reports and later witness testimony suggested the mother had, on more than one occasion, discussed the idea of selling a child, statements that, if corroborated, changed the nature of the investigation from a search for a lost child to a criminal inquiry into potential malicious intent. Investigators pursued such leads carefully. Hearsay alone would not convict, but it would prompt targeted interviews and scrutiny of possible accomplices. As the work of police and prosecutors deepened, the story left the purely local sphere. When allegations appeared in reporting that a child had been sold to a traditional healer for money and purported ritual use, public reaction hardened. These were the sort of claims that spark intense emotion, suggestions of a parent's betrayal combined with fears about ritual practices and trafficking. For investigators, the imperative shifted into two parallel tracks: the immediate practical task of locating the child, and the criminal investigation of who had the motive, means, and opportunity to remove and sell a child. For the community, the months that followed were a bitter mixture of vigil and public anger. Where neighbors had once offered normal assistance, some became witnesses to a case that would rapidly expand into courtrooms and national headlines. Families organized search parties and asked national media to keep attention on the case. The social dimension intensified as grief and suspicion mingled. The question, "Where is Joshlin?" became both a plea and an accusation. In terms of the forensic timeline, the earliest period of inquiry, the days and first few weeks after the disappearance, focused on witness statements, any available CCTV, phone records, and possible physical evidence in the area where she was last seen. Police also recorded statements from family members and associates of the mother, looking for any sign that someone else had taken or received the child. Over time, pieces of testimony and small physical leads led the police to further lines of inquiry and ultimately to arrests. Those first days, when the community rallied to search a neighborhood, would later be measured against the courtroom record that established how events had unfolded before and after Joshlin was last seen. When investigators widened the net, several strands of potential evidence and testimony developed. Interviews with neighbors and local pastors, review of phone records, and careful re-examinations of the mother's account produced discrepancies and leads that the investigating team could not ignore. A significant step in any child disappearance investigation is the cross-checking of accounts. Police compared what the mother told them with witness statements. They pursued information from community members who reported that the mother had previously spoken about the idea of selling a child. These accounts were not simply repeated gossip. Some witnesses testified to direct statements they had heard. Because such testimony is sensitive and potentially inflammatory, investigators documented it and sought corroboration from multiple, independent sources wherever possible. Parallel to collecting witness testimony, police executed operational steps. They interviewed friends and associates of the mother, searched residences, and sought to identify anyone who might have facilitated the transfer of the child. Investigators also explored the possibility of a transactional exchange, whether someone had been paid to take the child, and who the buyer or recipient might have been. That line of inquiry led authorities to look into known interactions between the mother and individuals identified as healers or sangomas in the local area. Such checks require tact and cultural sensitivity because traditional healers are a legitimate profession in many communities. The question was strictly about evidence of an illicit transaction. Another crucial development in the inquiry was the emergence of witnesses prepared to provide more detailed testimony. At trial, several witnesses would be described in reporting as having relevant personal knowledge: neighbors, a pastor, and an individual who later cooperated with prosecutors. One of those witnesses' statements, as reported, placed the mother in conversations about selling a child, a claim that prosecutors later used to argue premeditation. As police gathered statements and searched for physical evidence, they also worked to identify any accomplices. In cases where a caregiver is implicated, investigators examine whether the alleged act could have occurred alone or whether co-conspirators were required. In the Joshlin case, the eventual indictments named multiple individuals. The mother, a boyfriend identified as Joaquin Boeta Apollos, and another friend, Stephen O. Van Ryn. The pattern of naming multiple accused suggested that investigators had discovered links, whether through witness testimony, phone connections, or other evidence that indicated coordination. The decision to arrest is never taken lightly. For prosecutors, the decision to charge the mother and co-accused hinged on whether sufficient evidence existed to support reasonable prospects of conviction. In this matter, the prosecution assembled a case they believed demonstrated that Joshlin had been taken, sold, and transferred, not simply lost or wandering away. Key elements included witness testimony that the sale was discussed, alleged monetary transactions, and testimony suggesting that the child had been delivered to another person. Once the arrests were made, the investigation moved into a legal posture, charging, remand, and the beginning of pretrial processes. Media coverage accelerated. The case transitioned from active fieldwork to courtroom preparation, with investigators preparing witness statements for disclosure to defense counsel and court scheduling preliminary hearings. The investigative phase also involved cross-jurisdictional considerations. Because trafficking often involves movement across municipal boundaries and may involve individuals not resident in the immediate area, police sometimes used national databases and collaborated with neighboring police districts. In the Joshlin matter, the reported cooperation between local police and higher authorities ensured that the investigation maintained momentum and that the evidence collected in the field could be secured for potential forensic analysis and witness protection where necessary. In short, what began as a community search developed into a structured criminal investigation. Investigators pursued both the heartbreaking question of where the child was and the criminal question of who had committed an offense and whether that offense involved the sale of a child. Those parallel inquiries informed arrests and the laying of charges that would ultimately lead to the courtroom door. Court proceedings transform investigation into public record. Testimony is given under oath. Evidence is scrutinized in adversarial exchange, and the task of the prosecution becomes proving the elements of the offense beyond reasonable doubt. The Joshlin case proceeded through this crucible. The prosecution's case relied heavily on witness testimony and the narrative the witnesses constructed about the months and weeks leading up to Joshlin's disappearance. According to reporting, one of the striking elements presented was testimony that connected early, prior statements allegedly made by the mother to a pattern of thought and planning. Witnesses reportedly described conversations in which the idea of selling a child was discussed months before the disappearance. The prosecution presented these as evidence of motive and premeditation. Another critical element was the testimony of co-accused or associates who chose to cooperate with investigators. In many criminal cases, a witness who once was part of an alleged conspiracy provides the prosecution with an insider account in exchange for reduced charges or immunity. Their testimony can fill evidentiary gaps. At trial, such witnesses described the logistics of what had occurred, claimed to have knowledge of payments, and placed the child in the custody of individuals outside the immediate family. The prosecution presented this testimony paired with supporting statements to build a cohesive picture of the alleged trafficking. The defense, as is customary, challenged the credibility of witnesses and contested the inferences the prosecution drew. Defense counsel argued that witness recollection was unreliable, that statements had been misinterpreted, or that the alleged transactions were either fabrications or misunderstandings. Where the prosecution relied on hearsay, the defense had opportunities to cross-examine and to call into question the chain of custody of evidence and the integrity of recollection. Courts weigh such contests carefully. Credibility is often the fulcrum that determines outcome. Court reporting from the proceedings also described medical and psychological dimensions raised in the courtroom. The defense raised the mother's health at certain points, and the court had to deal with requests for medical care or to accommodate conditions. Those procedural moments, while peripheral to the core evidentiary disputes, shape public perception and ensure that the accused receive a fair process. Importantly, jurists and judges are tasked with focusing on admissible evidence, evidence about cultural practices, or hearsay about ritualistic motives must be tested for relevance and reliability. The court, in its process, distinguishes between morally alarming claims and legally admissible proof. For the prosecution to secure convictions on trafficking and kidnapping charges, it had to establish that the accused intentionally removed or detained the child and that the transfer included a monetary consideration or an element consistent with trafficking. Throughout the trial, media coverage kept the public informed of witness accounts, cross-examinations, and judicial observations. Significant pieces of testimony included the recounting of monetary sums and alleged recipients, and statements from those who were said to have been approached to perform rituals. This is where cultural complexity enters legal analysis. The court must consider whether cultural practices, when alleged to intersect with criminal acts, are being presented as motive, cover, or as mischaracterizations. As the trial moved toward its conclusion, prosecutors summarized their argument that there was a pattern of pre-planning, that funds had changed hands, and that the accused had the requisite intent to commit the offenses alleged. The defense summarized that the evidence was insufficient, that witnesses were inconsistent, and that the accused's accounts had been misunderstood or misreported. In this adversarial exchange, the judge evaluated the weight of testimony and the legal sufficiency. One of the heavier burdens for the court was the missing child herself. With Joshlin still unlocated during the trial, the court could only adjudicate based on testimony and evidence presented, not on a recovered victim's statement. The absence of the child raised an acute moral dimension. A conviction might punish wrongdoing but could not by itself rescue the missing child. This absence, repeated throughout the trial, created a backdrop of unresolved suffering that the legal process could not easily amend. After full presentation of the prosecution and defense cases and consideration of applicable law, the court reached its decision. In May 2025, the mother, Kelly Smith, and co-accused were convicted on charges, including human trafficking and kidnapping. The court imposed severe sentences: life imprisonment for human trafficking and additional fixed term years for kidnapping. The judge's sentencing remarks, as reported, emphasized the seriousness of selling a child and the need for a strong deterrent to protect vulnerable minors. Judicial reasoning in these circumstances rests on the elements of the offense. For trafficking, the court considered whether the prosecution had proven that the defendant intentionally transferred custody in exchange for material consideration, and whether the nature of the transfer involved criminal exploitation. For kidnapping, the court considered whether there was unlawful removal or detention of the child. The aggregated evidence witness testimony about the sale, testimony about payments, corroborating statements from insiders formed the evidentiary basis for the convictions. Sentencing in cases involving children includes special aggravating factors: the vulnerability of the victim due to age, the breach of parental responsibility, and the public interest in strong deterrence. The judge in this matter explicitly referenced the breach of the parental bond, the deliberate act of a mother selling her child being among the gravest of offenses in the court's view. Hence the imposition of life sentences, which in South African jurisprudence denotes the highest level of culpability. The court also ordered ancillary measures, typical in child protection-related convictions, entry into child protection registries, and restrictions designed to prevent future contact with minors. These orders are designed to protect potential future victims and to impose legal limitations that reflect the seriousness of the acts. Legal reactions across the country varied. For many, the sentences were just a necessary, stern societal response to an act that fundamentally undermined community norms about parental duty. For others, questions persisted. Could the sentences, however substantial, compensate for the ongoing absence of the child? Could the state find the child and bring some form of closure? The court, within its remit, had delivered criminal accountability for the acts proven before it. The search for Joshlin, however, had to continue in parallel. After sentencing, appeal rights and processes are normally available. Defense teams in such serious cases often examine whether legal errors occurred that could give rise to appellate relief. The public, meanwhile, watched a legal process that had moved from communal outrage to adjudication in a formal courtroom. In legal terms, the prosecution had met its burden. In human terms, the unresolved question about the child's fate left a moral void that imprisonment could not fill. A court verdict is an institutional endpoint, but the human story continues in many directions. For Joshlin's family and for the Saldanha community, life after the conviction remained marked by grief, activism, and continuing search efforts. Police statements reported continued operational searches in the areas where leads suggested the child might be, and community groups coordinated to keep attention on the still missing child. Public reaction continued to be intense. Protests in local communities, demands for faster discovery procedures, and calls for improved protections for children. Civic organizations and child protection groups used the case to press for stronger prevention measures, educational programs for vulnerable families, social service interventions to support struggling caregivers, and improved channels for reporting potential abuses or exploitative plans before they become criminal acts. The case also rekindled debates about cultural practices and how they intersect with criminal conduct, where prosecution alleged that a traditional healer was paid to receive a child for ritual purposes. Advocates stressed the need to distinguish legitimate cultural practices from criminal acts that exploit religious or cultural frameworks as a cover for trafficking. Authorities and community leaders urged nuance. Respect for tradition must not impair the enforcement of laws that protect children. From a policy perspective, the case generated a number of concrete proposals: improved registration and tracking for vulnerable children, enhanced coordination between social services and policing when reports of dangerous or exploitative talk surface, and community outreach to identify families at risk of exploitation. NGOs working in child protection pointed to the case as a reason to increase resourcing for social workers who can intervene in families showing signs of severe dysfunction. The media's role in the aftermath was also the subject of reflection. Coverage kept attention on both the moral dimension in the practical question of whether the state could still locate Joshlin. Journalists were urged to balance public awareness with careful reporting that does not jeopardize ongoing searches or the dignity of victims and families. In many such cases, the scrutiny brought by media attention both sustains public pressure for action and can complicate sensitive, on-the-ground operations. The case has broader resonance for South Africa's justice system. It highlighted how child exploitation can intersect with poverty, social breakdown, and opportunistic behavior. For law enforcement, it became an object lesson in the need for rapid, interagency response when leads indicate the possibility of trafficking, and for social services, it underscored the urgency of early intervention to support vulnerable households. Finally, the open wound of not knowing where Joshlin is remains central. Sentences can punish those found guilty, but only recovery and reunion can truly close the circle for a family. Civil society continues to press for search operations, tip lines, and international cooperation if needed. The community that once rallied for a missing child continues to insist that a child's life and location matter more than the completion of a courtroom theater.
This is Whispers in Africa. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed the true crime documentary. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe and turn on the notification bell icon, so you'll be notified when we upload a new video. You can also tell us what you think about this documentary in the comments section. I hope to see you in our next video. Bye.